I want to welcome you to the Dorothy Pearson lecture on equity and social justice. My name is Jan Greenberg. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work. It's a real honor today for me that Dean Teasley has accepted our invitation to speak today. This lecture is made possible by a generous gift from Dr. Dorothy Pearson, who is a graduate of our program. And before turning it over to Professor Roberts, who will introduce Dean Teasley, I want to say a few words about Dr. Pearson, as her story is one that I really find inspirational. And as a graduate myself of the UW-Madison School of Social Work, I take really great pride in being a Badger when I tell this story. So you'll need to indulge me. So Dorothy was born in Darbun, Mississippi. It's a really small farming community. She was the youngest of 9, and she refers to herself as the surprise child. When she was 8, the family moved to Bogalusa, Louisiana, a small paper mill town. She excelled in high school, and her parents were really supportive of her aspiring to a higher education. Her 8 younger siblings never went beyond high school, and many didn't graduate from high school. She went on to receive her bachelor's degree from Southern University in Baton Rouge in 1959 and was about to enter graduate school at either Atlanta University or Fisk University, which are historically black universities. But 5 days after receiving her bachelor's degree, she decided that she'd take a trip up to Milwaukee as a vacation, where her brother lived. And as she recalls, I don't know if any of you have been to Bogalusa, Louisiana, in the middle of summer, but it is hot and humid. She recalls falling in love with the cool breezes off of Lake Michigan. In the late 1950s and the 60s, early 60s, the UW-Madison School of Social Work actually had 2 campuses, one here in Madison and another campus in Milwaukee. And also part of her, so she decided that she was thinking about maybe she would go to School of Social Work here in Madison. But part of her motivation for wanting to attend the UW was the fact that the South at that time was really deeply segregated. And Dorothy wanted to know what it was like on the other side, as she says. She had done well in a segregated school system and wanted to see if she could make it in an integrated school system. So she decided to apply to the UW-Madison Milwaukee Social Work campus. So this is in the summertime, far past the application deadline, right? And she was initially told, you have to wait a year, but you don't tell Dorothy to wait when she's determined to reach a goal. So she decided to make an appointment with the director of the School of Social Work in Milwaukee, on the Milwaukee campus, and he met with her, and he was so impressed that he granted her a waiver and had her accepted into the master's program. Now she had to deal with the fact that she had little to no money, right? And she was an out-of-state student and could no way afford the out-of-state tuition. Back then, the graduate school had these special scholarships in the form of a waiver of out-of-state tuition for kind of promising young scholars. So Dorothy was admitted to the School of Social Work, but she couldn't afford the tuition, and she called the graduate school, and the graduate school told her that all of these scholarships had been already allocated. So what Dorothy did was she called the dean's office and set up an appointment with the dean of the graduate school. And she went in and she made her case for why she should get one of these out-of-state scholarships. And the dean at that time was so impressed that he decided to make an extra waiver for one of these in-state scholarships for her. So now she was admitted to the School of Social Work. She had in-state tuition. Now she just needed money to kind of live on, right? Okay. So she, back then, like the VA today, right, had these stipends for students. These large, especially large family agencies used to offer stipends to social work students. It was common when I went to school here in the 70s. So Dorothy decided that that would be one avenue for her to support herself, right? So she applied to one of these large family service agencies in the Milwaukee area. She was accepted into that field placement, but when she met with the director, they said that they had allocated all of their stipends for the year, okay? All right, but he had, when she met with him, he was so impressed with her, he said, but if you do really well during your first semester of your graduate school, I'll make an exception, and I will make an extra stipend available to you, right? Eventually, she entered the School of Social Work, and she struggled the first semester, but she got a stipend and completed our MSW program. And then she went to work for a couple years, and then she came back, and she got her PhD in 1973. As a PhD student here, she founded the Wisconsin Association of Black Social Workers in 1972. She went on after getting her PhD to a position for a short time at the University of Miami School of Medicine and the Barry School of Social Work. And then she went on to a position at Howard University, where she remained until her retirement in 1999. At Howard, she established a doctoral program and social work degree. And many of the speakers we've had are former students in that doctoral program. And she became the first director of that program. She was also a founding member for the advancement of doctoral education and social work, and she served for many years as the associate dean at Howard. Dr. Pearson has been the recipient of many awards in her career. The National Association of Social Work bestowed on her its highest honor, the honor as a social work pioneer. And in 2017, we honored her here at the school with the Distinguished Alumni Award. Dr. Pearson is obviously somebody who's touched my life in a huge way. And she's obviously has a keen intellect. She's incredibly highly motivated, somebody who kind of persevered, persistent, and did not let obstacles kind of get in her way when even though these obstacles were mighty high. However, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that part of her success was the fact that doors here at the UW-Madison were open to her at a time when doors were being tightly shut to African Americans across higher education. As a young woman in her early 20s, though, she had the vision and the courage to walk through those doors when an opportunity rang. Her story and success gives me incredible pride in the School of Social Work, that became part of it, but also pride in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Every time I tell the story, I feel like it's the first time I've told it. So with that background in mind and having a picture of who Dorothy Pearson is and the meaning of this lecture, let me turn it over to Director Stephanie Roberts, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Stephanie Robert, the director of the school, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Martell Teasley today. Dr. Teasley earned his MSW at Virginia Commonwealth University and his PhD in social work from Howard University. He then was on the faculty at Florida State University College of Social Work for a number of years, earning tenure there, and became chair of the social work department at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He's now dean of the College of Social Work at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. This is the beginning of his second year, and I had the privilege of visiting their school just last month and doing some work with them and seeing their beautiful college. Dr. Teasley's research and teaching in social work has had a particular focus on social work in schools. Teaching in this area and conducting research on school social work and topics such as bullying, cyberbullying, school choice and Afrocentric charter schools. And he's written editorials advocating for change, such as an editorial on shifting zero tolerance in schools to restorative justice, a topic that is near and dear to many of our hearts here in the room. His teaching and research has also covered a range of topics related to cultural competence in social work. For example, he has a paper that's a review of social justice and diversity content in course syllabi, and another paper that examines perceived levels of cultural competence for school social workers. He also, when he was at Florida State University, chaired a disaster recovery certificate program right after Katrina. So that was an important program in teaching BSW and MSW students how to do that work. Dr. Teasley has had a number of important leadership roles in the social work community, and right now one of his important roles is as the president of the National Association of Deans and Directors of Schools of Social Work, which is a mouthful. So I get to see him in these national venues showing leadership in how schools of social work should come together to address many of society's current problems. So I appreciate his leadership, and I'm so pleased to introduce you to him. I'm eager to hear what he has to say and learn from him. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thanks to everyone. I'm really glad and proud to be here with you today. A little jet lag. I had to get up at 4-something this morning, but I'm doing well. I actually met Dr. Pearson. She was actually exiting Howard University as I came there, so I do know who she is. Our paths crossed, but I never donned her door in terms of teaching. So, but I will make sure that I contact her and say thank you for the time of being here. So I had tried to put some color into this PowerPoint. As I was telling Jan, it went haywire on me, so I decided to just leave it black and white. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So I'm going to, the title of the presentation, as you see here, I'll read from the abstract that I sent in. So populism is an appeal to grassroots citizens as a challenge to the values of the established structure of power in favor of government and policy making that more directly addresses the needs of the people. Silent on racism and bigotry, homophobia, oppression of immigration populations, anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim rhetorical messages, 21st century populists in the United States seek to undermine many progressive era gains in favor of authoritarian rule and nationalism. What this means for the social work profession and its stance on social justice and human rights has received little attention within research literature. As stewards of social justice, the social work profession must do its part to hinder potential destructive influences of the growing populist movement while demonstrating its commitment to economic opportunities, reducing inequality, morality, human rights, diversity, and inclusion. So within this presentation, I will conceptualize characteristics of the current populist movement and its meaning for the social work profession. In building an argument with implications for the social work profession, I will also discuss some strategies for consideration at the micro, meso, and macro levels. So first, let's just take a look at some definitions of populism here. Populism arises in the context of a political crisis where legitimate and institutions is questioned, the legitimacy of institutions is questioned, and when the political status quo seems incapable of responding to populist demands. So both the left and the right have not done very much to reduce the growing inequality in this country, and so therefore you see the rise of populism. Populism leaders most often come from outside the political class. Remind you of anyone? That is, they are outsiders to the ruling elite. Their appeal is that they are from the ordinary people and uncontaminated by the political class and their long-term enshrined interests. There's a couple of the definitions here. Populists remain a politics of hope, a type of redemption politics where the Messianic leader promises a better world for those left behind or locked out of economic, social, and cultural rewards and privileges resulting from the move to neoliberal and globalization. Populists see themselves as true Democrats, voicing popular grievances and opinions systematically ignored by government, mainstream parties, and the media. And just a few definitions of a populist leader who makes a strong appeal towards nationalism, both domestically and his stance on the international stage. Populist leaders expose the traditional elites as the enemies of the ordinary people. And populist leaders attach and discredit traditional civil society organizations and political parties who are seen as unnecessary and useless to the restoration of proper power back to the people. Okay. So perhaps the greatest era for the social work profession was that of the progressive era, starting in the 1890s, running through the 1920s. Progressive era reform was characterized by a marked period of widespread social activism and political reform in the United States, much of that taking here in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin Act deal, as I'm sure most of you know, or you should know. One can identify the progressive era with social justice as it tackled longstanding problems due to rapid industrialization and unfair labor practices, government corruption, immigration, and urbanization. It was a time when common citizens challenged government and its policies to address workers' rights, women and children's rights, and labor issues such as pay and benefits and dangerous conditions in the workplace. Progressives set up training programs for social welfare workers in order to formalize practice and advocate for less fortunate families. The iconographic image of Jane Addams and Hull House as a form of residential community service for the poor and newly arrived immigrants to settlement houses typifies social work's leadership of the period. The clear and present challenges that call social workers into action during the progressive era are just as present today with the growth of populism in America and around the world. Human rights violations in the form of the detention of asylum seekers fleeing persecution, xenophobic immigration policies, voter suppression, growing inequality, decreased welfare rights, racism, and a backlash against diversity and multiculturalism are social trends that squarely differ from social work values. Indeed, a small group of scholars already are challenging the profession on its stance on Islamophobia. Noble maintains that our current populist movement also provides the social work profession with the opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to social justice, community well-being, democratic principles, and human rights, and reminding the reader of the history of the 21st century. Noble cites the quick erosion of human rights during the time of Nazi Germany. And I think it was 1933, 34-ish, one of those years when Hitler gets elected. Prominent Jewish folks put a editorial in the German newspaper saying, all this stuff Hitler's talking about is just phooey, okay? We have laws here, and he's not going to be able to do any of these things that he's talking about. You know the rest of that story. She opines that a culture of anti-humanist populism and authoritarian welfare can erode the human rights framework underpinning social work and other humanitarian professions. Therefore, the social work profession must understand the challenge that the profession faces in dealing with populism in the 21st century. In the 21st century, the term populism is most often associated with authoritarian form of politics. Populist politics revolve around a charismatic leader, as I've said, who appeals to and claims to embody the will of the people in order to consolidate his or her power. In the current era, there are populist movements throughout the globe, particularly in westernized countries. The reason for this are manifold, but mainly hinge on increasing inequality. Noting that Brexit appears as a victory for the real people in Britain, according to Princeton University political scientist Jan Mueller, he quotes and says, "Every populist operates with a symbolic and ultimately moral distinction between the real people and those who don't belong," unquote. In many ways, today's populist movement has a long history in its making. It represents the climax of a longitudinal process to rid the United States of its status as a federally sponsored social welfare state, to do away with the promise of a social contract where government intervenes to promote social equality and provides, in what is considered a redistributive process, services to those less fortunate as a social good. Consider for a moment two sets of founding fathers for the country, with the era of Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and a cast of others, viewed as the original founding fathers or the first wave. The first wave of founding fathers ensured that wealthy landowners received the highest rights and privilege based on their status, and that government should not succumb to the wishes and whims of the masses, nor should government restrict the masses from individual freedom and the fruits of their labor. The second wave of founding fathers comes into place with the New Deal and FDR and the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s, to include the many political policies triumphs during the Civil Rights Movement. From the desegregation of the military by President Harry Truman in 1948, veterans' benefits under the GI Bill in 1944, the triumph of the Voters' Rights Acts and Medicare in 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and other civil rights legislation gave progressive liberals a lasting victory that shaped American social welfare for the rest of the 20th century. The efforts of the second wave of founding fathers witnessed the expansion of the middle class, gross poverty reduction among many minority groups, including reductions in disparities in educational outcomes, and overall greater movement towards the American dream. However, since the advent of the progressive era and its climax in the triumphs of the Great Society, political conservatives and libertarians have mounted a sustained effort to reverse social policy and government-fund social welfare programs to aid the poor, through reducing union workers and their benefits, and the need to reduce educational programs such as Head Start. The quintessential goal of libertarians and conservatives has been to rid the United States of its guaranteed social welfare program, to reduce taxation and government oversight and regulation of financial systems in America. How this movement by conservatives and libertarians helped galvanize and encompass today's populist movement in America is something that historians, sociologists, and social psychologists will write about for some time. With the proliferation of political think tanks in the 1970s and 80s, there were a series of policy moves crafted by conservative politicians, aided by many liberals, that culminated an ongoing reduction of the social welfare safety net in America, while at the same time helped to produce growing inequality throughout the United States and through westernized democracies. So let's look at this first graph here. And if I had a lot of time, we could talk about subsequent presidents, whether they are liberals or conservatives. What we see here is the decreasing share in this kind of brown golden line here of the bottom 90% down to 23% of all wealth in the United States, while we see an increase in the amount going to the top 1% over time. And if you notice, this is during Clinton, Bush, and Obama presidencies. And so we see increasing inequality no matter who those leaders are. And this is one of the problems that populists have. During the period of the during this period, the 1970s and 80s, the United States middle class really starts to lose ground. This happens with the demonization of government and its far-reaching programs. At the peak of shared prosperity in 1973, the poorest 20% of households nevertheless had only 4.3% of total income. By 2003, this tiny share shrunk by 20%. So that meant that The poorest 20% only had 2 points, about 2% of the income, where the middle fifth quartile lost even more ground. The share of the top quintile, that is, people at the top, grew at the expense of the bottom 80%, and yearly since 2000, it garnered half of the nation's total income. So all of the wealth basically gained within the country is really going to the top echelon, and this is nothing new. Today, for many former middle-class communities, well-paid union jobs are mostly gone. Much of the blame for the loss of U.S. jobs in the United States has been attributed to globalization and international treaties that have reduced wages of the American worker. It was the conservative Ronald Reagan, though, who loosened regulations for international tariffs on goods once solely made in the United States and bought in the United States. From the 1980s to the present, nearly 40% of American manufacturing base moved overseas. Data from the U.S. Department of Commerce showed that the United States multinational corporations, the big brand name corporations that employ a fifth of all American workers, cut their workforce in the U.S. by 2.9 million during the 2000s, while increasing employment overseas by 2.4 million, unquote. Real wages for household or high school education American men have fallen 40% since 1970s. For the bottom 90% of workers, average wages have flattened since the 1980s. Many older white men are in despair. They suffer a much higher than average death rate due to alcoholism, consumption of drugs, and even suicide. While life expectancy for all other groups is rising, even for African American and Hispanic men, for that group between 1990 and 2008, for older white men without a high school diploma, it has been reduced, and they are left in despair. The perpetual motion of the American dream machine, on what Arlene Hochschild refers to as the dream machine, stopped due to automation, offshoring, and the growing power of multinational countries. The year it stopped, she states, was 1950. People started to have less income and less net worth, and many have experienced downward mobility. If you were born before 1950, she says, your income rose and you gained assets. If you were born after 1950, and this is a generalization, it did not. This is the first generation that experienced downward mobility, so that they obtain less income and less net worth than people do 10 years before them. Since the 1960s, the share of men aged 25 to 54 no longer looking for work has reduced by 1/3. According to Populists, American politics, particularly the government, society, and culture, are all headed in the wrong direction. As Arthur Yakamish Monk states in The People versus Democracy, today's populists are no longer disillusioned about government. They have turned to anger and are more willing to engage in anti-democratic methods that disavow democratic norms. In what we perceive as rights for the people. For populists, neither individual institutions nor individual rights should usurp the will of the people. That's really dangerous if you think about that. So we don't pay attention to individual rights or institutions. We pay attention to the will of the people. Therefore, liberal institutions may need to be undermined, according to populists, in order to sustain the will of the people. According to Arlene Hochschild in Strangers in Our Own Land, there are many people in the United States who see themselves as above the government and its high ideals about how people should live. But these same people use a host of government services. More generally, there are large swaths of Americans who associate big government with affirmative action, the promotion of multiculturalism, a noisy big brother, a remote control big brother, a bad parent playing favorites, a federal instead of state Department of Education, taxes, and an assistant beggar at the door. The government takes money away from people of good character and gives it to those of bad character, those who are idle. Head Start, Medicaid, SNAP, supplemental nutrition programs supported by liberals are all out of order, according to populists. The problem with government for the populists is that while both the left and the right have different agendas, there is more or less a common agenda supporting the conditions and contexts in which growing inequality has manifested. Yet in her research on rural Louisiana, Arlene Hochschild, in terms of understanding why a people affected by industrial, commercial, environmental pollution from a local plant have become anti-environmental themselves. Hochschild attempts to understand how many of the local people who need and use government services and benefits, even some of the affluent, actually despise government. Their use of government services as it suits their pleasure, this seems to be an acceptable acceptance, she says, based on the logic of rural Louisianans who have experienced greater times in the past. As Monk makes plain, just 25 years ago, surveys demonstrated a great respect for government among the American population. In the 1980s, most citizens were satisfied with government and rated government institutions favorably. However, that has changed today. While 2/3 of the United States seniors believe that it is extremely important to live in a democracy, less than 1/3 do among millennials. In 1995, 1 in 6 Americans believed that the Army rule was a good form of government. Today, it is 1 in 6, stating that military authoritarian rule is a good rule for government. According to Monk, a democracy without rights belongs to the tyranny of the majority, or in this case, the tyranny of populists. On the other hand, rights without democracy leave rule to the wealthy and those with compelling advantages over others. Monk declares that we are in an era where populists are now attempting to undo liberal democracy. So let's just take a look at a few more graphs here. So over time, what we see here is that in general, the top 1% has gained most of the wealth, as I've talked about, and there's been diminishing returns for the rest of us, unless some of you are in the top 1%. And so that is really the crux of the problem here. And this makes for all types of problems within social work education. As faculty talk to me about not knowing how to talk to students about these issues, If we look here, while the group amongst the richest 10% has increased, most of our wealth is going to the top 1%. So if we look here, this is like the top 1% all by themselves here, with 40% of the wealth, okay? And this is the other kind of 10%. So 10% of the people own about 90% of the wealth in this country, and the rest of us vie for the 10% that's left. That's a depressing side. So here, if we look in terms of the World Economic Report, in terms of the challenges and why populism is rising across the globe, what we see in other countries is the same thing that's happening in the U.S., where here, this is called an elephant curve by economists. The bottom 50% capture 12% of the total growth, okay? And that mostly went to emerging countries like China and many Asian countries, where our jobs were shipped overseas, which we saw the squeeze on many people and westernized democracies in the United States. And then, while that's taking place, the top 1% captured 27% of the growth. So that's really why you're seeing these populist movements all over the globe. Now, one of the problems that we have here really relates back to the 70s and 80s during the Civil Rights era. So many of us are in here are old enough, and some of you have studied the programs created during the Civil Rights era. The Manpower Program, the CETA program, I can't remember what that acronym stands for. But my point is two things. One, we were training people for jobs that we were shipping overseas. And two, we demonized the advent of training programs to help people and prepare them for a high-tech society. And so all of that has emerged, and that's a problem that we have right now. There are plenty of jobs. We just haven't trained the people for them. and we were training people for jobs that we were shipping overseas. Okay? And that's a central problem that we have in this country right now. Given that liberal democracies are losing their appeal to many westernized cities, has led to a gross imbalance in wealth, as I've talked about. Liberal democracies have become less adept in producing for its citizens. Liberal democracies are experiencing a performance crisis, according to Monk. Populists have seized on such crises around the world, and they're exploiting this weakness in an appeal to liberal Democrats and government. In general, power declines for a given form of government when it does not produce for its citizens. In the United States, it should be noted that whites first start moving to the right in 1972. 41% of whites were in the Democratic Party. By 2014, there was only 24%. And in 2014, we now have 24% who are Republican. That shifted to 27% who are now Republican. Now, a solid number of whites have shifted to populist politics, and the tent is widening for those who are empathetic and believe in populist stance. With the election of Trump and the possibility of his reelection, and it really could happen, Monk poses the question now becomes whether we will move from a populist moment to a populist age, which he believes will cast a grave danger over liberal democracy. One of the staples of the social work profession is its continued focus on the impact on inequality. According to the preamble of the NASW Code of Ethics, the primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and live in poverty. Given its focus on policy formation and its impact on social welfare and client-centered practice, the reduction of inequality stands central to the mission of the social work profession. For this reason, the social work profession must place a strong emphasis on social justice as central to any attempt at advocacy for oppressed and vulnerable populations and dealing with populists. Yet the profession has witnessed an explosion of inequality, but has not developed a planned and sustained professional response. In his award-winning language at the 2016 Society for Social Work Research Conference, Dr. Michael Sherrod of George Warren Brown, the Brown School, commented that from the progressive era to the present, the social work profession has placed less interest on social welfare policy than it did in the past. Moreover, the global top 1% earners have captured twice as much of the growth as the 50%, as the lower 50%. The bottom 50% has nevertheless enjoyed important gains, as I pointed out there. The global middle class, which contains all of the 90% of income groups in the EU and the United States, has been squeezed. According to Joseph Stiglitz, growth inequality in the United States is on the rise. We are now a country of the 1%, for the 1%, and by the 1%, he says. Today in the United States, just 8 Americans have as much wealth as the bottom 35% of Americans. At the same time, nearly 50% of Americans have less than $500 in the bank. And the average 401k has about $50,000 in it. Stiglitz points out that increasing inequality and poverty have eviscerated the American middle class, reduced social mobility and economic opportunity for the vast majority of Americans. As these shifts have occurred, there has been exponential economic gains among those at the top, as I've stated. Reduced economic opportunity for good-paying jobs and rising national inequality are a central complaint of populists. Economic inequality is widespread in the United States and throughout the industrialized countries. For Stiglitz, it is American social policy that has created inequality, not shipping jobs overseas. Inequality is not a product of globalization, but a lack of workforce investment and social welfare planning for a high-tech economy. What did take place was a social compact of measures fostered by the GOP to reduce the country's social welfare safety net for many blue-collar workers and for some white-collar workers because the population and the country grew more towards financialization. This was done through demonization of workers' unions to include teachers' unions, the move towards reducing corporate pension plans, corporate deregulations, outsourcing, reduced consumer protection, and government spending that has ballooned the national debt, to name a few. The debt used as a reason to make further cuts to government and to exclude the cultural other is one of the things that is really fomenting populism. All of this has set the stage for group tribalism, meaning that there is great awareness of group identification as a form of protection and loyalty. In a moment of clarity for all of us, while we talk about increasing inequality, we are in many ways experiencing a mini economic boom in the country. So gross national product is going up, there are more jobs, but some of that's fool's gold. For example, only 25% of people work from 9 to 5. Some people work from opening to noon, come back. They're working low-wage jobs with no benefits, and pension plans have been reduced just about throughout the United States. I had a big age gap about 2 years ago when I was in the classroom doing a lecture on social welfare policy, talking about pension plans, and a student raised his hand and said, "What's a pension plan?" Because they basically don't exist for certain groups anymore. Okay. Such a climate is anti-immigration and at times xenophobic. In fact, it is anti-individual or against any group's values set that competes for social resources versus those who are, quote, rightful citizens of the land and stewards of the culture, that is, white America. Amid the shrinking footprint of social expenditures and increasing inequality, public opinion often perceives immigrants as taken away from established U.S. citizens who are more deserving. Politicians are thus encouraged to emit populist messages intended to assess the legitimacy of a new model of social protection based on the ideals that social rights have ethnic and cultural bases as well, and that citizens who have lived longer in a particular territory and who have common cultural heritage and origins are more deserving than others. In the imagination of populists, a leader needs to be elected or was elected who will fight for the true wishes of the people. All institutional roadblocks obstructing this person from carrying out the will of the people need to be undermined. In the imagination of the populists, quote, government has displaced freedom. It has taken away community. It promotes diversity. It has taken church out of school. It does not protect its citizens. Its officials do not live a simple life. The government gives too much, it does too much, and it owes too much, unquote. An anti-establishment identity formed within the working class members who voted for President Trump. What elites who were against Trump did not realize is that as they railed against his lifestyle and talked about him as being a reckless person, populists saw them as one of them. According to Amy Chowa in her book Tribes, Trump's base identifies with him in several ways. Quote, he is not a feminist, not politically correct, gets caught making mistakes and doesn't read books. They like the way he talks, the fact that he shoots from the hip, and his mannerisms and vocabulary are all imperfect, but much like those of ordinary people, unquote. Thus, with non-ideological approaches to government, the election of President Trump, who dislikes government and states that he speaks for the common people, is part of the rise of Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. Of course, the real surprise for President Trump and his ascendancy as the so-called leader of the free world, to include his now rising poll numbers, is that this was not supposed to happen in America. For America is exceptional. It always does the right thing, and it carries the moral vanguard for the world as we know it. Part of the danger of populists who celebrate demographic principles, but only as they directly relate to the wishes of the people, is that they are misguided due to the short-term thinking and disregard of institutional norms. With politicians doing dog and wolf whistle political tactics, mixed with racial, ethnic, class strife, xenophobic tendencies, and cultural wars debates, misguided tribals and ethnic anger has been used as part of political persuasion, thus creating a paradox where people end up voting for people who support legislation that appears to satisfy some need, only to find that the voting decisions created need in another area. For example, in Thomas White's What's the Matter with Kansas, he notes that a rich man's economic agenda is paired with social issues as the winning formula for political advocacy for the right. For example, vote to stop abortion and receive a rollback in capital gains taxes. Vote to get government off your back and receive a conglomeration and monopoly everywhere from media to meatpacking. Vote to strike a blow against elitism and receive a system where wealth is more concentrated than ever. Vote to get rid of socialized forms of health care and get an out-of-control, unaffordable, free market health care system. Get tough on education outcomes and safety in school and create a school-to-prison pipeline. How does this occur? It occurs through tribalism itself as a normative process in which inequality creates group homeostasis leading to social tension. A great part of tribalism is racism. As Amy Chua writes, quote, "Racism is group consciousness at its most repugnant, built on the premise that human beings can be divided by skin color into innately superior and inferior groups. Yet, paradoxically, as a form of group blindness, racial categories like black, white, and Asian erase ethnic differences and identities," unquote. In America, tribalism divides people into racial and ethnic groups, geographic areas, and class and status. Within this group, people form deep stories, according to Arlene Hochschild and her Strangers in Our Own Land, deep stories about themselves and their experiences. The deep story is one imprinted in the mind about one's experience in life, feelings about those experiences, and the language and the symbols that accompany a deep story. Because of its fixation on feeling as knowing, the deep story is sometimes void of facts, removed from objective judgment, but full of truth based on feeling. Quite often, people form empathy walls, shutting out greater understanding of the cultural other. From here, people form a subjective set of ways in which they view the world. Deep stories about one's experience helps create structural amnesia, according to Hochschild, in people, whereby people are less inclined to deal with macro problems such as structural and institutional inequalities that lead to the conditions and contexts that they find themselves. So people are more worried about the here and now instead of the big structural thing. In such an environment, deep stories about the cultural other, which are needed for greater understanding of humanity, are rarely given space and consideration. My last section, I'll talk a little bit about culture and identity politics. Now that the United States has transformed from a majority white population to a majority minority population faster than any other European country in history, it really has. Let's just look here, another piece on inequality. So we see that across the world, inequality has increased. India has been the greatest abuser in not sharing wealth, and the U.S. and Canada are kind of second place there. But here we see from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a graph of the increasing share of immigrants and people who are non-white to the United States, with a projection of 2060, 78.2% of the population there. And this is causing all kinds of problems. Really what we must understand is that pushing people off of the land, what we're witnessing from an anthropological perspective is people migrating back to those very lands that they were pushed away from. except for those folks who were eliminated, like the Native Americans. Now the United States is transforming. I talked about that. It is experiencing racial strife that is reminiscent of a gone-by era in the country. 47 million people in the United States are born abroad from 140 different countries, which is the highest among nations. However, as inequality increases, groups often retreat into tribalism. They close ranks, become more insular and less tolerant. Thus, racism, ethnic and cultural bias have become more pronounced as inequality has increased. As Amy Chua states, race has split America and class has split American whites. On the one hand, racist claims are made against whites who now feel that they are being discriminated against because of their whiteness. Combined with growing levels of growing fixation on identity politics, populists point to the problem of diversity. Cultural wars are on display throughout our country. In August of 2017, after a white nationalist march on the campus of the University of Virginia, a Unite the Right rally held in Charlottesville, Virginia, where violence broke out and someone was killed. According to journalist Eugene Scott of the Washington Post, he found that, quote, a lot of blue-collar men think they are living in an increasingly feminized world, and Donald Trump represents them unabashed, he represents unabashed and unapologetic masculinity. And his in-your-face refusal gives in terms of giving in to the politics of political correctness and sensitivity. These notions of inclusivity that drown out the individual and group voice of populists have become a sensitive issue and is the substance of identity politics. Given the emotional enclaves that people place themselves into, it is hard to build a coalition of trust when mistrust is already assumed. The new political climate in America is one that is moving towards placing restrictions on the social welfare rights of the cultural other, from elements of the American dream, namely the use of the social safety net. I think what will end up happening as we attempt to resolve the immigration problem, something we already have, is different statuses of citizenship. More than likely, some people will never become citizens, or they'll be in so much debt that it'll be hard to ever become a citizen. And that's more likely where the country is headed, or is already there. Rising inequality and now increasing U.S. debt will continue to breed austerity measures that restrict universal notions of citizenship and social rights. September 11, 2001 exacerbated xenophobia in America, particularly for those from Middle Eastern descent and Muslims in general. The terrorist attack and the takedown of the Twin Towers of New York was a surreal experience for America. Part of the response was the increase in what is known as the surveillance society, characterized by the proliferation of social control measures which have heightened the public sense of insecurity. The political bait that has ridden the wave of public fear, and many countries have seen the radical revision of universal discourse and the democratic principles on which societies of the Second World War were constructed. Indeed, a sense of unchecked immigration, particularly illegal immigration, is front and center to populists. For populists, established politicians have a misguided fetish with diversity, empathy for illegal immigrants, and they root for enemies of the country. Neither independent institutions or individual rights, in the case of human rights for immigrants, should exceed the will of the people, and thus the will of the people needs full support with no compromise. Universal brotherhood or appeals to human rights are incompatible with the nationalist needs of the people. Thus, it is not only permissible but expected and respected when President Trump designates immigrants from Honduras seeking asylum as people who are gang members, Islamic terrorists, murderers, and part of drug cartels. So for the populists, this is appropriate. Large numbers of whites are anxious about the so-called browning of America. As Chua explains, when groups feel threatened, they turn into tribalism, as I've said. The closed ranks becomes insular and less tolerable. The reason for this anti-oppressive movements are disenchanting about inclusivity and universalism is that they see an abatement in funds for social welfare programs that they need. A 2011 study showed that half of white Americans believe that whites have replaced blacks as the primary victims of discrimination. Paradoxically, the reality for many black and Hispanic Americans is that they see no way of parity with whites in terms of wealth and assets. So here's my last slide, well, one of the last graphs here. So for all of what the United States has done, particularly in terms of black America, they've gained no more than 3% of the wealth, okay? It's about 2.5%. What we see here is that whites still have most of the wealth, and while black wealth has increased somewhat in terms of assets, you see the disparities here. And then if we look at our Hispanic brothers and sisters who have surpassed African Americans in wealth, but I say that with a caveat because there are a lot of people here who are legal and who are Hispanic who we don't count in terms of their income. The populist movement is real in America. Hate crimes have considerably increased since 2016, and during the Obama presidency, ammo and gun sales were at an all-time high based on perceived fear that a black man as a president would attempt to extinguish the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, that is, the right to bear arms. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, hate groups formation has been energized since the results of the 2016 election. The number of hate groups have risen both years of the Trump administration. Important to mention is our national lack of understanding of Islam, which has led many to see Islam as a monolithic religion and evil. Quote, uninformed, many Americans believe that Islam has no values in common with other cultures. It is inferior to the West and is for violent political ideology rather than a religion, unquote. When feminists challenge the social order of sexual harassment, assaults, violence, and economic domination built on masculinity, it often infuriates traditional gender role groups. Further, the claim for equal pay with men at a time when blue-collar white male unemployment and living wages are on the decline is a bitter pill that will find it hard to penetrate many white male empathy walls and their sense of personhood as the foremost protector and provider for families. Fringe or borderline quotes and speaking gaffes by activist groups is the stuff that Rush Limbaugh and his notion of feminazis ferment on in terms of their diatribe against women. It was Limbaugh in 2015 on his nationally syndicated radio show who stated, quote, feminism was established so as to allow unattractive women easier access to mainstream pop culture, unquote, unquote. On October 21st, 2018, the New York Times reported that the Trump administration, just this last week, is considering a narrower definition of gender as biologically an immutable condition determined by genitalia at birth, the most dramatic move yet in a government-wide effort to roll back recognition of protection for transgender people under federal civil law. For the populists, when the established structure of power puts forth issues based on ideals about multiculturalism as achieving parity with traditional values, such practices are not the best interests of the people because they are perceived as intruding on limited resources for those who deserve them most. So I think you get my drift there. I'm going to stop there and go into some implications for social work. One, that we must continue to support our ethical norms and values, and we must practice them with no exception or abatement to the rules. When people ask you to do exceptions to the rules, there shouldn't be. We already probably are being compromised, say for example, in Texas with the detention camps. Many of the people probably working down there seeing some of these despicable things are social workers, asking us to compromise our values. We also should not speak pejorative truth, that is, truth that's in our favor. And that's a problem with America in general. People just have these myopic lenses and these empathy walls, as Arlene Hofschild notes. But it's our ability to discern facts which makes us responsible citizens, and we must all take responsibility for the world that is and the world we want to live in. Social workers must also advocate for political accountability, transparency into democracy, and in our social justice agendas. Join groups that challenge populist policies wherever they manifest themselves. In meeting with clients, but remember that we are the people who meet clients where they are. So we engage populists, we have to listen to their story, okay? It may be painful, but you gotta watch NBC and Fox News, okay, to know what's going on. You just can't watch one side, the one that maybe favors your particular persuasion. Work in solidarity to develop and support a humanized society. This is huge. Affirm and recommit to a practice with human rights, with the human rights agenda, and become more politically and morally active as role models. Recommit to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and critically informed social work practice. You know, a lot of people don't think oppression still exists. And so you can't have drive-by debates with them. You have to sit down and talk with them and explain to them how people are oppressed. Give witness to the human toil of subjugation, oppression, racism, tribalism, and structural disadvantages. Social workers must insist on maintaining professional ethics and standards of practice, as I said, and we must defend and support institutions in our democracy. So voting is an institution. Now, there's a huge movement for voter registration amongst the profession. Some of us talked about this years ago. I think it's a bit Johnny and Jane come lately, and I'll tell you why. If you read Carol Anderson's book, One Person, No Vote, she talks about how since the rollback of the Voting Rights Act, nearly 900 voting precincts have been disbanded in the United States, mostly in minority communities. And so, you know, a person asked me recently, they said, well, why does black people don't vote? And I was like, oh, here we go. What I had to explain to them was this, and I put it in this context. If you were in Mississippi in 1850, and Carol Anderson talks about this in her book, and voting cost $1.50 when the aggregate income of a black family was $100 a year. $1.50 was a lot of money. Not only that, you had to read a section of the Constitution when you were illiterate, and you had to count precisely the number of jelly beans in a jar. And so that's how you stop people from voting in 1890, 40 years after Reconstruction. The way you do it today is you move the polling places, you stop voting on Sunday early, after church, and then you don't give people time to vote, or you do these things like you gouge the voter rolls that you're seeing taking place in countries. So it's the same type of impact that we're having today. And so as I told the person that, she said, oh. But you have to explain those things to people. Major social work organizations must come together and build in a human rights agenda. So the National Association of Deans and Social Workers, Deans and Directors, NASW, CSW, all need to come together to have a common agenda. Most of the time we run scared, okay, in terms of what we may do. But it's not that time in history, because the point I'm trying to make here is that the populists are playing hardball, okay? They're not going by the rule of law. They're going by the rule of the people. And Trump's their man. And his popularity is not dwindling, it's growing. So we must realize that. The social work profession needs to develop an intersectional form of social justice that examines inequality as it pertains to the unique challenges that identity groups are concerned with. So instead of this whole intersectional notion of identity, we need to develop what I call an intersectional form of social justice that's inclusive of everybody, including the populists. We must expose the work of these demagogues like the president one sitting in the White House, who are not really for the people, but for themselves. Social workers must continuously practice professional ethics and be suspicious of situations which are declared exceptions to professional ethics. Do not speak pejorative truths. I talked about that. I think that one there is a bit redundant. This is a big one here. So while we talk about challenging the dual loyalty dilemma, clients versus government policy, really we're talking about this micro-macro curriculum dichotomy. So I have said to the CEO of CSW, the Council on Social Work Education, Darla Coffey, that social work has an internal and an external problem. She says, what do you mean by that, Martell? Well, internally, when you come into a social work program, most of what we teach is clinical practice. When this is a time when greater understanding of how our society and political understanding is needed. Externally, that's what people see us as clinical-based practitioners. And that's not enough if we're going to live up to the greatest times and assets of our profession. I think you get the drift there. So we must advocate for political accountability, transparency of democracy, and the social justice agenda. I think I talked about this. This is where my slides got a little bit muttered. I think this is the last slide here, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You said join groups.
Yes.
What groups in Madison do you recommend?
Well, I would imagine those that support institutions within our country. So whether it be education, whether it be voting, whether it be rights for a particular group, but we should have no abatement on them. We shouldn't be ashamed of, of joining those groups. So if one's a feminist, if one's pro-black, but we must listen to both sides in doing that. And so, we get these myopic lenses because I'm black and, black essentialism is extremely important to me. Someone else's essentialism is important to them also. So support, see, because one way to tear down a democracy is to remove rules and institutions. And so if people are able to gerrymander and reduce voting for particular groups, that's a problem, okay? Some of the things that are taking place now are very problematic, where we saw Neil Gorsuch, who was up for the Supreme Court, not even given a hearing. Then we ushered in a person recently, and that whole debacle that took place there in the demonization of the women, that was highly problematic. Because young people are watching, and they see this as a way as we conduct ourselves in terms of our institutions. And so if our senators are supporting these pejorative truths, it's problematic. We're going to have to join organizations to fight back and build coalitions, and it's going to take time. So, a lot of what we do is meism. It's about me, so I need to see some change right now because I did X, Y, and Z. Well, change occurs over time. And the people who initially wanted to end slavery, the people who wanted to have women vote, the people who wanted to stop seeing immigrants pick fruit for little money, many of them died in the struggle. While we have beautiful stories about the civil rights movement, there were people who tried to register people to vote, who were lynched, and we never heard about in southern towns. It's going to take those type of efforts to maintain our democracy.
So I get to ask a question now. So one of the dilemmas that
I face is I feel like there's this disjuncture between two of our roles. So on the one hand, we talk about, and you talked about how as social workers, one of our roles is to be able to bridge and talk with different people and be the bridges when there aren't many bridges between the tribes.
Sure.
On the other hand, it's really important for us to be the loudest, most vocal voices to stand up for social justice and what's going on in the community. Now, maybe those two roles live together, but I have a hard time embodying both of those at once. And maybe I'm alone in that, but that's something that I feel complication over. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I would say you're in it for the long haul, and so it's how long you're going to be that loud voice and who do you pass the baton on to. And so we are, you know, it's like family. Well, the older I get, I realize everything I do needs to really be for my children, so I can pass along legacy and then help them to do the same thing. And so that's really what it's about. It's about capacity building. And so, as the ancient Egyptians would say, may the love of you last to, may the love of you last to the memory of you. And so it is the memory of people who do certain things to protect institutions. Not necessarily being the loudest voice, but the most persistent voice. That is important, if that helps.
Yeah, that helps. I also feel like we need to, as social workers, be some of the more radical voices out there about social justice. So I understand maybe as individuals we can't each have all of those roles.
Yeah, you know, when we say we're radical, I'm not sure if people know what that really means. Being a radical is really, I mean, tough hold. If we think of people who were radicals, if we think of the Black Power movement, which was radical, if we think of my cousin, Wudula Islam, who was the first woman in America who led a prayer for Muslims and was disbanded from a group and left the country. Radicals face a lot of challenges. Dr. King represented the radical church, you see. And so I think there's some degree between advocacy and radicalism and the evolution of a process so that we're here now, where do we need to go? So you've got to admire the anti-abortion people in their longitudinal process of what they do, whether you believe in it or not. There was, and many of us in here are old enough to remember when you couldn't put a fetus on a billboard. But that was a major triumph for them. Now, radicalness for them was blowing up abortion clinics. That was, you know. But they have pushed and pushed and pushed, and they keep their agenda front and center. And they leave a continuing constituency of people to pick that work up as they move on. And we've got to do that also as social workers. So we've got to have something that we stand for as social workers that we're not afraid of. And what may be radical for our major organizations and not being so worried about being sued and being so litigious. Because whenever I talk to them about, hey, we should try this thing, first thing they say is, well, the lawyers don't like that. So we've got to do some out-of-the-box thinking. You know, you got to admire our president because every script they give him, he tears it up and just shoots from the hip, as they say. You know? And so he has a radical critique of the status quo. That's true. How many radical actions is he willing to take? I don't know. So let's be temperate when we say that. That's my point there in a long-winded way. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's kind of like an observation more than a question. I really appreciate this talk. It's interesting. I met this guy a couple weekends ago at the Y, and he was talking about the Red Sox in Massachusetts, and he was from Massachusetts. What brought you here? And he's sort of like, oh, I got a job at the VA. Well, what do you do? I'm a social worker. Get out! I'm a social worker too. That's awesome. But I talked to this other guy that works in the VA. He's like, yeah, you know, I'm not really owning it. And I could connect with that, right? Because you say you're a social worker, first thing in our society, oh, you don't make much money. And so I think we tend to not live it. right? Like, we can get out of the practice, and that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is really living it and challenging ourselves to challenge other people. And these are scary times. So the more we get out of practice with owning it, the more we get sheltered and cloistered, and we're not really living out in the community.
Well stated.
It's vitally important.
Yeah.
We have to.
I
Not
mean-
live it just at our job. I don't think anybody here is just, 5 o'clock, they flip into another person, but really being forceful.
Yeah. So there's well stated. I mean, there's something more to the profession than being clinical entrepreneurs, diagnosing people's problems. So the early founding people of the profession, particularly women, debutante women, that's not what they were about. They could have done a whole lot of other things with their time. Many of them had money and came from wealthy families. But they chose to take on advocacy for groups. They chose to go into factories to deal with problematic working conditions. They chose to deal with children who were being stuffed into chimneys to be chimney sweepers and who had tuberculosis and were getting poor nutrition. They chose to do all of those types of things. They got out of their comfort zone. Okay, and so I'm a war veteran, and so probably the scariest time in my life was being bombed. Okay, because it's coming from the sky. You don't know what the heck's going. But one of the things that did for me that put things in perspective is like some of the things that we think are so daunting here are very minuscule, And we have this whole sense of meism that I have to do it myself when we have the coalition build. And that's huge. So we've individualized ourselves so much that we're docile. And so that's one thing that the populists are doing this collectively. So thank you.